Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now a while back I mentioned wanting to do fun stuff on Fridays, so that's exactly what I've chosen to do here. This fella is a 3D print. He comes from the McAngry store on My Mini Factory. He is also going to be available. There is talk of a physical release for these guys, so if you don't have a printer, cruise along, sign up for an account there anyway, and keep an eye on the news from that sculptor. I really like the dwarfs that have come out so far, and I think it's going to be really exciting to watch this range develop. In particular, just painting something unusual and putting it on the table, whatever game you want to play with it, is fun, and I've really enjoyed doing this today. So kick back, all of the paints will be listed in the description below, along with the method on how I've got this snow base. Let's get started. Now I've taken the time to clean up and cure my print, and once I've done that, I've hit him with a primer spray of matte black from the Army Painter. It does not matter at all which black you use here. Honestly, black paint is black paint. Very little of this is going to sort of be visible without us having done something to it. So black doesn't matter. It's all good. I've chosen this fella. These are modular actually. The kits themselves you can assemble how you like. Just as an example, let's put him aside for a second. Here's one of the same dudes from the range. The lasguns, those big chunky Rogue Trader era lasguns, I love them. They're so cool. The range of heads in the kit is just really nice as well, and they assemble really easily, just a couple of dots of super glue. The torsos and legs are one piece, so there's 7? There's quite a few options anyhow, and I'm really pleased with that. So I'm going to put him aside. We're going to concentrate on our fella here. Now the first thing we're going to do might come as a bit of a surprise. I'm actually going to dry brush the entire miniature with some Thunderhawk blue. Particularly on the black, areas that are going to be black later, this is going to give just a little bit of visual interest to that black. So instead of it being a flat, boring color, there's a little bit of variation there. I also tend to find that if you just very lightly flick over everything while you're doing this, you're able to see just a little more easily what it is you're doing. Now these fellas, most of the creases and folds on their gear run horizontally. So you'll find it easiest, I find, to go up and down with your dry brushing. That won't look like much just yet, but I think you'll see it does lift things up a little, makes it easier to see, and when we shade this, that's going to come together quite nicely. I'm going to move on. I have here Bugman's Glow. Any skin color that you like for your dwarfs is up to you. But I tend to think, I don't know, I know that underground and digging all the time, you'd assume they don't see a lot of sun, so they're probably kind of pale. But I prefer the opposite idea, that they're these really tough, ruddy little dudes. I don't know. Bugman's Glow is what I'm going to go for. You will find over black, in some areas you're going to need to come back and give it a second coat. And particularly up around his face, just paint straight over his beard as well. It is not going to matter one jot if you cover that hair, because of course we're going to paint that later. One other detail there I am going to paint some of this though, is on his shoulder pads. Let's get that into shot, goodness me. I'm going to paint a little stripe, quite roughly, down the center of his shoulder pad here, and on the other side too. No, I'm not painting him with weird fleshy shoulder pads, but this is an excellent base coat for something I'm going to use later. Stay tuned. I've decided in the end that I want him to be wearing gloves, but of course you want the arms out, biceps like that, why would you not show off the guns? Now I'm going to go up to probably the biggest surprise in a while. I have here Fire Dragon Bright, and this is why I've base coated these shoulder pads with skin tone, because orange, for reasons I don't fully understand, covers much better over a skin tone than even a darker orange underneath. Now you'll see the coverage on that. I'm still going to want to come back, let this dry, give it a second coat, but I'm not being terribly careful yet because the darker color I'm going to use to paint the armor, I can use to tidy up this stripe as I like. So one coat now, let this dry, give it a second, and I'm going to have a nice bright orange stripe up there. Now with that orange dealt with, what I'm going to turn to here is Warg Flesh, which is always fun to say. This is a really nice saturated green color. What I'm going to do is start blocking in very carefully at first the armor. And basically turn that into a slightly more respectable stripe than half the shoulder pad is orange. At the same time, I'm going to go ahead and paint in all of the armor too. Now you could use Castellan green here, but I want a slightly more saturated finish. You'll probably see up close like this that there is a very slight sort of hammer-beaten texture to the armor, and I'll be honest, I didn't like it very much at first, but it's growing on me. I like the idea now of this armor that looks like it's been banged back into place a few times. Yeah, all the bits that are going to be green painted armor, well, paint them green. It's when I've reached this point that I realize I have more or less stolen Boba Fett's new look, but you know what, I'm going to lean into it. I like that green and orange. I have now some lead belcher, and we're going to paint in the metallic details. Reason being, I used to paint like weapon casings and stuff like that first, and then try and painstakingly paint the metal around them. But instead, it's easier to paint these bits, and then paint the casings as a tidy-up stage. So any little bits that you want to be metallic, like a silvery metallic, I'm going to do a couple of the, I guess, cables on his armor. I'm going to paint in silver. But yeah, knock yourself out. Now, you'll find that this covers quite well over our black primer. On some of the flat panels, you're going to need to come back and give that a second coat, so you've got a nice solid surface. And you'll see here on his belt buckle, I've coated that just once with lead belcher. It's going to make it a little easier when we come to do that a brassy color later. For now though, I'm going to paint in the leather details. So his gloves, his boots, and his belt. For this, I'm going to use Mournfang Brown. Now, this will cover fairly well. I mean, we are working from a black primer, so you're probably going to find most of these will need a couple of coats. But not to worry. It's a nice rich color going on. And when we shade it, it's going to look fantastic. Now, if we're going to lean into the Boba Fett inspiration here, what I've got is burnt red. This is a Vallejo color. It is a little bit darker than corn red, which you could use in its place. Or even something like Galvorbak red if you want a slightly purpler finish here. But this, to me, quite closely matches what I've got in mind. Now, I'm going to paint in the weapon casings with this. And, what else do I need to paint with this? I don't know. I think the weapon casings will be plenty. Wasn't that a nice red? I really like that color. Burnt red from Vallejo, definitely one worth picking up. We're going to finish off his face here, and I'm going to use Xandri dust to paint in his beard. Now, there isn't really a correct answer, of course. You could paint it in black or brown. Just whatever you do, don't use the same brown that you have for your leather equipment. The final base coat we're going to apply is some Balthazar gold for that little beaten brass belt buckle. There's a lot of alliteration happening there. Now you could use here Retributor armor instead if you wanted a brighter gold finish, but I think brassy is going to look way cooler here. Once this is dried, what I'm going to do is cruise around the miniature and do any cleanup. Once all of those base coats are dried and you've done your tidy up, it's time for some fun. I've shaken up my Agrax Earthshade good and proper, and I've got a big old chunky brush here. We are going to just bucket this all over. Oh goodness, that's just magic, isn't it? We're going to bucket this all over the entire miniature. As always, make sure that you are getting it into any recesses, any chunky bits of detail, and then we're going to leave this for about half an hour to dry. Any big flat areas where you're worried about it pooling, like for example up on his shoulder pad here, while it's wet, just brush it away, guide it to where it needs to be. But yeah, let's come back in a second once this has dried. And then once your shade has dried, you're going to have something that looks like this. And that's not looking too bad. A little bit darker in some spots than I might like, but we're going to fix that up now. And I'm going to start first of all with his skin. Now for this, what I'm going to turn to, this is Tanned Flesh from the Army Painter. This is a little bit lighter and a little bit warmer than Bugman's Glow. So when we use it as a highlight over Bugman's Glow, what we're going to get instead is a nice, rich, reddish skin tone, which isn't too bright. So making sure that you're leaving a little bit of your Bugman's Glow in the recesses. Take your time here. Use a smaller brush if you need to. But we're just going to brighten up some of the areas of his musculature and his face. Now that's nice and quick, and particularly on these miniatures, there's just so much detail on them that you can't really miss. That's really fun. I'm going back here to some Thunderhawk blue again. Now this is purely optional, of course, but you'll find that the drybrush we did earlier kind of acts as a guide for where you might want to add, there we go, a couple of edge highlights on your leather. So again, not strictly necessary, but it will look cool, I think. And you can be quite chunky with your highlights on these guys. I have now some Skavenblight Dinge. Now in this place, any medium to dark grey will work just fine. And instead of painstakingly edge highlighting all of our metal stuff, what I'm going to do is with just a little bit on my brush, I'm going to start just dabbing little spots and marks and ragged edges where I want some chipping later on. So along the edge of the shoulder pad's a good spot here. Let's just flick a little line and then randomly fill that out with some dibs, dabs, and specks. Very important that you get the terminology right for these. So what I'm going to do is go around all of the sort of painted metal stuff. So on the weapon here, let's just rough up the edge a little bit. And you want to go a little bit further in than you might expect with this, because we're going to paint over this in the next step. Now I did change my mind. It turned out that Skavenblight Dinge wasn't dark enough, so I actually went back and got some Eshin Grey. So in the subtitle, essentially, where it says Eshin Grey, that's not a mistake, I just corrected what I was using. I'm now using Runefang Steel, but any very light silver will work here. What we're going to do is basically patch in along some of that dinged up metal. So don't fill in the grey area completely, but using this, you get a really easy way of highlighting, painted metal without having to painstakingly edge highlight everything. Just take a second to very lightly dip, 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 and you'll find what you get is this cool beaten up metallic effect, which takes no time at all. Now good luck remembering all of the spots that you applied the dark grey to, but once you've gone around and chipped up the armor and the equipment, that starts looking real cool. It's so simple to do. Anyhow, I have decided I'm going to grab some Cadian flesh tone and put a little bit on the very tip of his nose and his ears, just to brighten up his face a little bit. And then we'll use some Ushabti bone to highlight his beard. Now, as long as you've got just a tiny wee bit on your brush at a time, don't worry too much if you get big splotches, because you can join them up. Obviously, the highlight color you use here is going to depend on what color you've done his beard. But anything which is just a lighter version of what you did the base coat will be fine. Using some Liberator Gold, I'm going to just batter in the belt buckle in a similar sort of way as I did the armor. Just dip, 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 dip some areas and leave some of the darker bronze in the recesses. Particularly the way that the miniature is sculpted, you'll find that you've got a neat texture to that very quickly. And then finally, with some Scrag Brown, if you want to, you can start highlighting some of his leather gear. Mostly, I'm going to highlight the back of his knuckles, just to define his hands a little better, and the edges of his vambraces. A couple of other little spots, like on his equipment pouches here. Looks quite good, but you don't need to go overboard with this. In particular, I'm not going to bother highlighting his boots. Once I've finished with this, I'm going to go take him outside, hit him with a matte varnish. I'm going to use the Vallejo matte spray, and then pop a base on him. Let's get a look at what this dude looks like when he is all finished.
And there at last, our Space Dwarf is complete, and I'll make sure to include in the description how I've done the base on that. By sheer coincidence, as I looked out the window, it was snowing at a very strange time of year. Well, not that strange, but snow seemed like the right choice. So whether you're planning to try and resurrect squats for Warhammer 40,000, or you want to play Grimdark Future from one-page rules and put some Dwarven guilds on the table, these guys are a really cool way of doing that. I love the chunky design. They're very reminiscent of early squats, those big las guns, huge chunky weapons.
they just fit the aesthetic. I think they look really cool without going really far into some of the stereotypical silly-looking dwarfish stuff that you see. Matter of taste, of course, but these ones, they suit me down to the ground. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who keep me ticking in paints and glue, including producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support lets me go out and do cool stuff like this. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.